Hey, what's going on, PFR Nation? This is Kevin Lau, your host of the Planning for Retirement podcast, and welcome to another whiteboard fireside chat in my house. Yes, I'm working from home once again today. My wife was out sick a couple of weeks ago, so I was working from home. Then my twins got sick, and now my oldest, now he's got the same thing. So it's just kind of slowly working its way through the family. But so far, yours truly, knock on wood, has been holding strong. So hopefully that continues. But anyways, I'm just here helping out while I'm working from home, which is always an interesting journey, to say the least. But today we're going to be talking about this idea of an emergency fund, right? Because we typically have this conversation with clients, and I feel like it's a different answer, in terms of like if someone is working and accumulating assets for retirement versus someone who's retired and they're literally living on their portfolio. Okay, so sort of on the one hand, it may seem like an individual that's retired, you know what I mean? They're 100% work optional. They don't need a big emergency fund, because a big reason to have an emergency fund when you're accumulating is, hey, what if you lose your job? What if you get laid off? Well, if someone is retired, they're work optional. If they get laid off, it doesn't matter if they were working. But if they're not working, they're fully retired. Do they even need an emergency fund? Okay. So I think like this mindset of an emergency fund, it's very personalized. So there's no right or wrong answer in this one. But I'm gonna kind of walk through this on the whiteboard today and just show you some of the frameworks that we think through, and also just talk a little bit about how the portfolio ties into this idea of an emergency fund in retirement as well. So why don't we dive into the whiteboard and have some fun with this one? So, first of all, the topic this week on the podcast was all about budgeting and cash flow. Okay, so it's such an important framework, and something that I feel like we haven't talked about in the podcast enough. Is just this idea of budgeting and how important it is to sort of bake in some of these key assumptions, for your retirement plan, in terms of like, hey, how much are you going to need to replace, in your income of your income when you ultimately do retire? How much do you need to be saving in order to achieve that work optional goal? How does your investment portfolio need to be managed? What are some of the tax arbitrage opportunities in terms of working versus retiring, and how your tax bracket might change over time? So there's like so many different frameworks that budgeting will help, or so many different questions that budgeting will help answer for you. Okay, but in this case, I just pulled up a client scenario where their monthly expenses, and truthfully, it's one of those things, like this is kind of their all-in number. And in terms of the budgeting framework we talked about this week on the podcast, we talked about this idea of needs, wants, and wishes. Okay, so some might say, hey, you know what, Kevin, let's have 3 to 6 months of an emergency fund, but let's just use our needs. Okay, but some might say, you know what, let's use our needs and our wants, because again, a retirement emergency fund is typically used as for a different purpose. Okay, not a loss of a job, but unexpected medical costs, home repairs, car repairs, or more importantly, a bear market or a recession. Okay, so in that case, you may not want to have to dip into a lot of your equity portfolio during those times. You want to be buying low, not selling low. Okay, so this is a big part of having an emergency fund in retirement, is this idea of this bear market protection. But in this case, we just use the framework of, let's go with their all-in expenses, which is just over $8,100 per month. And if we use this 6-month target, which again, there's no right or wrong answer. My dog's about to start barking. Guinness, Guinness. I'm recording a video, buddy. Thank you very much. This is the problem with working from home, in my opinion, is like, I've got this dog. He barks at everyone, and he's a pit bull mix. But this dude, come here, Guinness, come here. I'm going to show you on camera. Come here, buddy. Come here, bub. Come here. He's very shy, so let's see if he comes up here. Come here, buddy. Come here. You want to say hi? Come. Good. Go, big boy. Oh, you're such a big monster. Come here. Look at the camera, buddy. He gets so awkward and nervous. Guinness, look at the camera, buddy. Hey, pups. So he looks super scary. But this dude is afraid of his own shadow. Okay, he literally, I don't know what he's planning to do when he actually starts barking and acts like he's going to attack someone. He would never do that. So he's the biggest softie, anyways. So I don't even know what I was talking about. So this framework of budgeting for we're using the needs, wants, wishes. We've got this this retirement budget of $8,167, just over $8,100 per month. Again, yes. Liquidity target for this individual, this is all personal preference. Okay, so 3 to 6 months is kind of this standard rule of thumb, okay? As an emergency fund, and this is definitely true for folks that are in the accumulation phase, because I guess the idea of, well, if you were laid off, at least you have 3 months of your salary or 3 months of your expenses or 6 months of your salary, 6 months of your expenses before you kind of get back on your feet. And now you can sort of get back to work and stop bleeding down your cash nest egg. So that's kind of where that 3 to 6 month framework comes into play. And I think for all of you that are watching this, that are still accumulating, I think that's still a pretty good rule of thumb. I think, in terms of, do you have more or do you have less than that sort of that sweet spot target? I think that depends on how guaranteed your income is. Obviously no job is guaranteed, no W-2 job is guaranteed, but how guaranteed is your job? Like, are you a key employee? Like, or are you in a situation where you're like, hey, my department, we're going through layoffs. Like, that's a little bit more risky. Maybe you start to pad that emergency fund out a little bit. Maybe if you have a dual working family, okay, there's two working members in the household. So you're like, hey, if I lost my job, like, we're good on my spouse's income. Well, you may not need very much. You may need closer to 3 months or even less than that, with regards to your emergency fund target. So it's all personal preference on this one. For this client, we just used kind of that standard rule of thumb right in the middle of about 6 months. So that would indicate, hey, they need about $49,000 in an emergency fund. Okay. So why don't we go forward and why don't we look at their current liquidity situation? So their target liquidity, we just looked at, they needed roughly $50,000. Well, they currently have, it's about 42K. Okay, 42K. Let's put a dollar sign on that one. So ultimately their shortfall, as you can see, it's about $8,000. Okay. So, looking at this for me, it's like not super concerned with this. And the reason why is because this financial planning software is going to take their total expenses of 8167, right? But what this software lacks, okay, in terms of this liquidity analysis, and this is why financial planning tools aren't perfect, okay? They're definitely a framework to help us, solve for some of these more complex issues that we have for clients. But for emergency funds, it's like, hey, let's just use some basic math. They've got about $4,500 coming into the household. Okay, so $4,500 a month is coming in from things like Social Security and pension. Okay, so if we annualize that, that's about $54,000 per year that they have coming in. That is literally guaranteed, okay, that they don't need from the portfolio. So if you take half of that, which is 6 months of that income, we're looking at about 27K in terms of guaranteed income for over 6 months. Okay, equals 6 months. So if the liquidity target is 50, okay, but they have 42, well, they technically have 42 plus 27,000, because 27,000 of their expenses are basically being taken care of or feeding into their guaranteed income. That those expenses are not going to be needed to dip into the portfolio or dip into their emergency fund. Okay, so truthfully, they're actually a little bit overfunded when it comes to their emergency fund. They may only need, really the gap between 50 and 27K. They only may need $23,000 in their emergency fund. Okay. So do I tell them, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Klein, you have 42,000, you really only need 23 because 6 months of expenses that you need to dip into principal or dip into your assets, that equates to about 23K? Probably not. I mean, ultimately, what I'm going to tell them is, hey, here's your emergency fund. Here's your, what I might do for them? I might just ask them, hey, what is your sleep well at night number? You know what I mean? Like, what number in the bank do you feel like, hey, this is going to allow you to sleep really, really well at night? Okay, whatever that number is, I'm going to then compare it to this framework that we're using. Because if they come out and say, Kevin, it's probably 125,000. Well, maybe we need to talk about that, because we also don't want to overload the cash bucket, because the cash bucket, as we've talked about before, that's going to generate interest income. And as interest rates have popped a little bit over the last couple of years, now our clients are generating 4.5%, 5% on cash, which is all well and dandy. But if you have $100,000 in the bank earning 5%, that's $5,000 of interest income, and that's going to be taxed at your highest marginal rate. And that's also going to be added to your modified adjusted gross income for things like taxation on Social Security, for your tax bracket in general, potentially net interest income taxes, or of course, IRMA surcharges. So you need to be careful with not owning tax inefficient investments inside those taxable accounts, because it kind of, these phantom taxes can kind of creep up out of nowhere and bite you down the road. So you want to be careful with this. We don't want to overload the emergency fund. And that's why the last week's fireside chat, I talked a little about this idea of asset location. So maybe if 100,000 is your target, maybe you kind of think through, hey, this is my sleep well at night number. Maybe I do keep 23,000 in literal cash in a savings account, checking account, money market account, but then that other, let's call it 77K, maybe you have that in some other investment portfolio that's still liquid, okay, that's still liquid on your balance sheet, but you can tap into for those types of emergencies, which we're going to talk about here in just a second. So if we look at this client portfolio, okay, now obviously, from a distribution standpoint, we've got equities in the portfolio, both US and international, so they represent, just under 50%. Usually the target for them is about 50% in equities, okay? And then over here on the fixed income side, we've got about 51%, the target is around 50% in fixed income, okay? Well, within this fixed income, okay, we have actually about $200,000 in this portfolio in short-term bonds. Okay, super high quality, mostly U.S. Treasuries that are earning anywhere from 4.5%, 5%. So we've got $200,000 in the investment portfolio. Okay, do I consider that to be cash? I kind of feel like it's a cash alternative. Okay. And this is exactly what we talk about with clients. It's like, hey, you've got your investment portfolio, you've got guaranteed income coming in from Social Security and pension. How much is too much to have in cash? Because I do see a lot of folks, they kind of have this framework, especially when they retire. It's like, I'm living on this. I want to protect against the worst case scenario. Okay. Well, obviously healthcare costs, long-term care costs, that's a different conversation. We need to have a financial plan, a plan dedicated to protect against a long-term care event. But just kind of like your unexpected surgeries or unexpected medical bills or home repairs, etc. I feel like we can still use that 3 to 6 month framework. But a lot of folks have this mindset of, hey, I want to have a year or 2 years of my income or 4 years of my income in some sort of cash buffer. Because what if we go through a recession? What if we go through a prolonged recession where we need to dip into the portfolio? We know we don't want to pull from equities. We don't want to do that in a downturn. Okay, that would involve selling at the market bottom. Okay, but generally speaking, it is not perfect, but generally speaking, the fixed income is going to act as a non-correlated asset to fixed income or to equity. So if equities drop, typically fixed income pops. Okay, so like in 2008, equities dropped by over 35%. Well, fixed income that year, the ag returned just north of 6%. Same thing in 2009. Obviously the market was positive. The S&P ended up positive in 2009 by about 25%. But the first 3 months of the year, equities still plummeted. They were plummeting that first quarter, but fixed income returned about, again, another 5.5%, 6% in 2009. So it typically acts as a non-correlated asset to equities, but that's not perfect. Okay. If you think back to 2022, just recently, equities dropped by 20%. Bonds were also down 14, 15% in 2022. That's why it's super important when you're looking at, if you're going to look at fixed income as a cash alternative, in my opinion, you need to have some sort of short-term bond strategy. Bonds that are going to be maturing in, let's say, 1 year or less. Okay. So 1 year or less. On the fixed income side, if they're individual bonds, great. You have no principal risk. When those bonds mature, you're going to get your par value back. But even if you're using some sort of bond mutual fund or bond ETF, typically they're going to have a nice strategy there to go ultra short, so you don't have to worry about interest rate sensitivity and ultimately your prices being super volatile like an intermediate or longer term bond. Okay, so the fixed income funds we use that absolutely have that type of strategy in place. So if they've got $27,000 of guaranteed income coming into the picture, they've got $42,000 of actual liquidity. So really they have about $69,000 between their actual emergency fund plus income coming into the picture. Plus they've got another $200,000 in their fixed income, in the short-term fixed income piece of their portfolio that they can tap into. Now, a lot of these assets are in IRAs. The majority of this portfolio is in a tax-deferred vehicle. So you got to kind of keep that in mind. It's like, hey, if you did have a large expense where you needed to really raid your portfolio aggressively, okay, you need to kind of think through what exactly that might be. What's the tax implication of that? Now, at the end of the day, if you had an emergency come up like that, whatever that might be, I'm sure taxes are probably not at the top of your priority list in terms of taking care of whatever that emergency is. It's probably taking care of a loved one. It's probably some major home renovation. Okay, you think about the Hurricane Helene victims. I mean, a lot of them did not have flood insurance. What is that going to cost them to rebuild? Same thing with the victims in LA. What is it going to cost these individuals to rebuild? What is that process going to look like, with regards to FEMA and that whole mess that's going on there? Okay, they're probably going to need 3 to 6 months, maybe even a year of income in some sort of asset that they can pay their expenses, pay their mortgage, pay a rental, whatever that might be for a short period of time. So whatever those major unexpected events might be, just kind of think through where your cash flow is coming in. How does your current cash reserve fund stack up to the sort of that benchmark? What is your kind of that sleep well at night number? Okay. What is that sleep well at night number, and how does that compare to the actual financials? But then don't forget your portfolio, okay? Don't forget your portfolio, especially on that fixed income side, looking at your short-term bonds as also a potential asset to use in case of an emergency. And that way you're not overloading your cash fund that's going to create low returns and high taxes over time, okay? That's this idea of this tax drag. Sort of beyond the portfolio, one other strategy I'll kind of throw out there is thinking about your home equity and thinking about taking out a HELOC, a home equity line of credit, and just have it there on the sideline. I mean, these typically are $1,000 or less to open up a HELOC. And typically you can borrow up to 80% roughly, maybe 75%. I think the restrictions are starting to get a little bit tighter, but typically you can borrow 75, 80% of your home equity. So if you have a paid off home of, let's say, $1 million, you can probably get a HELOC for a pretty high number. Okay. Maybe not the full 750 or 800,000. There are limitations on that one, but you can probably get a $200,000, $300,000 HELOC and just keep that on the side. Typically they're not mature, but typically they expire after about 10 years. So you've got to renew it, but at least that's just going to be sitting there in the case of an emergency. So if we went through a major recession or a downturn, and let's say equities are down, let's say bonds are down significantly, there's nowhere to really run. And you're like, okay, I've got my cash fund, my emergency fund, but I kind of like to keep that at a certain level. Maybe you dip into your HELOC for a short period of time and replenish that HELOC when the market recovers. Okay, I'm just kind of thinking through assets on your balance sheet that you can utilize in case of an emergency. Another strategy that people use the HELOC for is to self-fund long-term care. You're like, hey, in retirees that are over 60, you can look at a HECM loan, okay, a home equity line of credit, and utilize the emergency fund portion of your HELOC or your HECM loan, kind of like a HELOC. Okay, so depending on your age, depending on whether or not you own your home or if you have a mortgage, looking at home equity as a potential strategy as an emergency fund alternative. Okay, so again, these are just for folks that are just kind of thinking through the first line of defense, cash on hand. Second line of defense, or I guess 1A, cash on hand. 1B, income streams that are guaranteed to come into the picture from Social Security, from pensions. Okay, and then second line of defense, you've got your portfolio. Okay, you've got other assets that are not necessarily sitting in cash, but you still have them on your balance sheet. And then third line of defense, potentially home equity. Okay, but the thing is with a HELOC, you want to take this out before an emergency happens. Like if we went through, let's say, a major recession, if you think back to 2008, okay, global financial crisis, banks were failing. Do you think banks were interested in giving a bunch of HELOCs out to individuals? No. Okay. So you need the HELOC on the balance sheet before that emergency comes up. It's like having insurance. Okay. You can't just go buy life insurance after you're diagnosed with terminal cancer. So you need to have it. You need to be proactive when it comes to this strategy. And it's definitely a great play for folks that are retired or approach a retirement to kind of serve as that last, maybe not last line of defense, but close to that last line of defense when it comes to an emergency fund. Well, that's it, everybody. Hope you guys found this valuable. check out the podcast this week. We talked about cash flow budgeting, and this really is going to help you frame up this question of how much do you keep in cash reserves? How much do you keep in an emergency fund? Because if you don't know your numbers, if you don't know what your fixed expenses are, what your variable expenses are, how are you going to calculate how much you want to have in terms of number of months of income or expenses in your reserve fund? So make sure to check out that podcast and make sure to check out next week's podcast as well. I'm going to be talking a little bit about this idea of giving yourself a raise in retirement, talking about the 4% rule, talking about guardrails, and talking about just the overall framework of taking distributions from your portfolio. So make sure to check that one out. And of course, make sure to like the video and share this with someone else that you think would find value in our content. And of course, make sure to subscribe to the channel. That way you can keep up with what we're doing. Until next time, this is Kevin Lau signing off.